got y'all's pen and paper ready?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to be doing 1 John. Tonight we're going to be going over the critical introduction to the book. That's going to encompass the authorship, the date, the occasion, the purpose for the book, the recipients, and like its theme and genre. Okay, and maybe some even some interpretative issues, because I know that there's one big one in the 5th chapter that is a very, very big interpretative issue. It's called the Comma Johannes, and it's found in the Textus Receptus, which means it finds its way into the King James Version, but no other version. So, you know, we've always got the King James people who are going to be like, "Oh, this verse right here, it's inspired." But if we really got into it, you know, it didn't show up, but in just a few manuscripts, like literally like 9 manuscripts. So we're going to deal with all that, but we'll actually deal with the Comma Johannes when we get to chapter 5 of the actual text. But I want to start out. We're going to look at the authorship of 1 John. Now, there are a lot of theories as to who this author of this book is. Now, if you actually read, which I don't know if you guys or anybody that's going to be watching this video later have read 1 John, it's an absolute beautiful book. It was a letter, supposedly. You know, some people will credit as that. We're going to get into that when we talk about genre. But it's absolutely awesome book in our Bibles. But if you'll read it, and you read them completely through it, there is no mentioning of who the author is. The writer does not say to so-and-so from anybody. It goes unnamed. The author goes unnamed in the book, and that poses a problem for many people because they don't know who it is. So we've had to attribute this based on historical evidences and church father quotes and church father traditions, and the general consensus is now that John the Apostle, the 12 disciples, the son of Zebedee, John son of Zebedee, is who wrote this, as well as the Gospel of John, 2 John, 3 John, and the book of Revelation. So the general consensus is that one man wrote all 5 of these New Testament books. But I want to give the options for the other authors that it might be. Okay, and this is where we want to write this kind of stuff down, because this is going to be crucial. Because if we need to know who wrote it, if we're gonna read it and take into consideration what it says, and we hold it as scripture regardless of who wrote it. So we want to know who it is. Number 1, John the Apostle. That would be John, son of Zebedee, the guy that we just talked about, the one that Yeshua chose in the 12 disciples. Number 2 would be, quote, the elder. Okay? I say this because 2 John and 3 John actually have a name. Like he references himself and calls himself the elder. Okay? But nothing more. So the reason we think it might be the elder in 1 John is because the writing style is so incredibly similar in 1, 2, and 3 John that it would seem as though the same author wrote all of them. So if number 2 and 3 are from the elder, then number 1 looks like it would be 2. Number 3, this is the beloved disciple. Quote, the beloved disciple. Now we get this beloved disciple title from the Gospel of John, because throughout the Gospel of John, the main disciple in the Gospel, which John's name is never mentioned in the Gospel of John. The name John is never mentioned in the Gospel of John, but the beloved disciple is always mentioned. So it's understood, because everybody else seems to be mentioned, all the key apostles seem to be mentioned in the Gospel except John. So they believe that this was a title that went to John the Apostle, but for the sake of reasoning, we're going to say the beloved disciple would be the third option, because we don't know if they were attributing that to John the Apostle, but that's just what by inductive logic, that's what we assume. Deductive logic, I'm sorry. Okay, number 4. The writer and composer of this book was a Johannine school. That's Johannie. Johannine school, which would be like the Apostle John or someone named John was a big minister in the first century, and this is his following. Like, these are the people sitting under him and learning by him and through him and of him, and have compiled this letter. Number 5 would just be, quote, John. Just be an individual named John. Not necessarily John the Apostle, but just an individual named John. The reason we say this is an option is because John, or Yohanan, or Ioannan in Greek, were incredibly popular names in the first century. Incredibly popular. Just like it is today. How popular is John today? It's a very popular name, just like Josh and Chris and Jacob. All of our names are really popular. Leanne's even got quite a few. Typically, I think a lot of Leanne's in middle names too, though. But anyway, so you see the point that we've got common names, and it makes sense because we're just common people. So someone named John can be who this might be talking about too. So the sixth option could be just disciple of, quote, John, the John that we're talking about just now in number 5, a disciple of that John. Okay, so we got a range of options. Now, the church attributed it to John the Elder, or John the Apostle, the same one that he chose in the 12 disciples. The church attributed the letter to him in the 2nd century. Okay? I like to fall into this category. I like to assume what we assumed in the beginning, that this is the same guy that he chose, son of Zebedee, the fisherman. It's the same guy. The church has chosen him in the 2nd century, and a good bit of evidence for this is the fact that that's the general consensus still today. So that's 1,800 years. That's 18 centuries. That means that argument that this was John the Apostle has withstood pretty much every argument for 1,800 years. And I mean, if it's true, then it's going to withstand the arguments. This is a very, very likely case for me that it would, that it would be true. I want to go back to the elder on number 2. We're going to just run down through these real fast. The elder, we know that number 2 and number 3, the 2nd John and 3rd John, are written by the elder. Now, we can assume, because I know you guys aren't familiar with the Greek text and how it's structured and the outlines and just the way that it's written as much as I am, and that's just because I studied at school. Maybe somebody that watches this video will be a Greek student and they'll understand here what I'm talking about too, but I want you all to know that I would assume and believe that the elder also wrote 1 John because it's so incredibly similar to 2 John and 3 John. Okay? But if we're holding to the idea that John the Apostle wrote 1 John, but we also say that the elder wrote 1 John because 2 and 3 John are attributed to the elder, then we must assume that that's one same guy. You understand what I'm talking about here? So if we hold that, X is John the Apostle wrote 1 John and Y, the elder, wrote 1 John, then if it's one author, then it's the same guy. So therefore, John the Apostle is the elder, and the elder is John the Apostle. Okay, and number 3, well here, the beloved disciple. It's almost, there are theories to who the beloved disciple is. I don't really want to get into much theory on the beloved disciple because there is an absolute crazy amount of people that have been suggested to be the beloved disciple talked about in the Gospel of John. Lazarus was one because Jesus wept when he died. Obviously, that means he loved him really well. So Lazarus would have been a possible one. Not really sure how Lazarus wrote part of the Gospel of John, which accounts for his death if he was dead, even though he got raised back. So I would not assume Lazarus would be the beloved disciple. Mary, mother of Jesus, was also supposedly the beloved disciple. Da Vinci, the Da Vinci Code, and all that. Mary Magdalene would have been a choice for that. Now, and that's actually what Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, ends up arguing, I believe. A lot of people could be the beloved disciple. I assume that since the beloved disciple is the author of the gospel, and I believe John the Apostle to be the author of the gospel, because the gospel starts out just like 1 John does. NRK and halagos, or NRK, that which was from the beginning, in the beginning was the Word. It's really similar to each other. So I would assume the author of the gospel would be the same author of the letter. So if we're saying that John the Apostle, who is also known as the elder, wrote 1 John, and we believe John the Apostle is who wrote the Gospel of John, then John the elder, or then John the Apostle, the elder, and the beloved disciple who wrote the Gospel would all be the same person. So what typically the general consensus is, and this is what I hold to, is that John the Apostle was all three of these. He was called John the Apostle, the elder, and the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple during the ministry and life of Messiah, and then the elder towards the end of his life, because he was going to be significantly older than most people. And in the gospel, or in the 1 John, he addresses the people as little children, my little children, which would show like a distinction between his age and his eldership to them. The Johannine school, number 4 theory, there's just no evidence to support that. I believe, I can't remember what commentator suggested that was a possibility, but there's really no evidence to support that, no church history quotes about it or nothing like that, so we're going to throw that one out. The author of 1 John is not the Johannine school. Okay, number 5, a person named John, just a random guy named John, because we said the name was really popular. The problem with this is, if this is just a random guy who possibly, sat under John the Apostle or Peter or James or whatever, the person that wrote 1 John has this apostolic authority. He's an eyewitness. He talks about what we've seen with our hands, or what we've seen with our hands, what we've seen with our eyes, what we've touched with our hands, what we have heard. So he's an eyewitness account. And he makes some bold statements in there, like doctrinal statements out of nowhere, it seems like. It's not all of it references back to the Torah, prophets, or writings, and not even the New Testament specifically, like some of the thesis statements in 1 John. So can this really be a person who was not an eyewitness or was not actually walking with Messiah while he was alive? I would say no. So that kind of rules out this one. He doesn't meet the prologue requirements, the requirements in the prologue which talks about his apostolic authority. The disciple of, this is number 6, disciple of the person named John. Again, if this is just a random person, he doesn't possess this apostolic authority like John the Apostle would possess. So, we're left with pretty much one option is what I'll hold to. That 1, 2, and 3, John the Apostle, the elder, and the beloved disciple are all one person. Okay? John, son of Zebedee of the 12 disciples, who wrote 1 John, as well as the Gospel, 2 John, and 3 John. Won't get into Revelations, but I mean, if we're pretty much holding that the same guy wrote these first 4, the Gospels, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Revelation's not too much of a stretch to believe he did too. He actually goes by his name in that one. So, for authorship, I conclude that, based upon all the evidence, that John the Apostle is the author of it. Okay? Now, there is one thing that we get to. There's this guy named Polycarp. Okay, I know his name sounds like a Pokemon, and it's kind of cool. But Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle. Okay, so Jesus discipled John the Apostle. Okay, because he was part of the 12 disciples, and then John the Apostle discipled Polycarp. It's just the next guy in line. So Polycarp, he walked with him. He was a student under him, and he learned a lot about him, knew him on a personal level. Okay, so you've got Polycarp there. You've also got this other guy named Paypious, P-A-P-I-A-S. Now, Paypious, he actually was a contemporary of Polycarp. Okay, now he grew up in the same area as John the Apostle and knew him as a child. Okay, so the theory is here that the writer of you have Paypious and Polycarp here. Now, they wrote a few things, but they were in the first century around the time of, 90 to 100 AD, 1900 years ago. Their writings don't exist anymore. We don't have a copy of any of their writings anymore. But we have some of their stuff that was quoted in the writings of Irenaeus and Eusebius. Okay? That's Irenaeus, Irenaeus, and Eusebius, Eusebius. Okay, and I'll make an outline for this in a PowerPoint, so if you don't get the names right, it's okay. So Polycarp and Paypious' writings exist a little bit in the quotations of Irenaeus and Eusebius. Eusebius and Irenaeus were 2nd century writers. So they quote from Polycarp and all that, and they get, and that preserves Polycarp and Paypious' writings. Now the thing is, Paypious wrote something one time about John, and when he writes it, and I'll put a link up to the quote because I've not got it with me right now. When he writes it, he talks about 2 Johns in just a really short paragraph. He mentions 2 Johns. He couples the first John with Peter and James and the apostles. He calls them the Apostle John. Okay? And then right after that, he mentions John the Elder. So, it seems as though Paypious was talking about 2 Johns, which goes back to the whole, just a guy named John theory. Now that seemed like a good argument that there was actually 2 Johns, because this is a guy in the 1st century writing this. But the thing is, the thing that Paypious neglects to comprehend or notice is that when he mentions Peter and James and Paul and everybody, he mentions them as elders as well. So it's nothing to mention John as John the Apostle and then turn around and mention him as John the Elder, which would mean it's the same guy, not 2 different guys. So that theory kind of falls apart, because that's the biggest theory, that it's not John the Apostle that wrote this. But I just want to throw that out there for the ones that want to get a little deeper in it. But we could go a lot deeper. But this is a critical introduction. But it's not going to be something we want to spend hours on, because there are pages and pages and pages and pages written on the authorship of 1 John. And if you ever want to read anything about this, or if you ever want just to get a good commentary, this is Karen Job's exegetical commentary on the New Testament. I'm showing it on the video right now. This is a great commentary, and this deals with the authorship, the structure, the dating, the purpose, all that, and then it goes into the text itself just like a regular commentary would. And then this is another good resource. This is the NIV commentaries, the NIV application commentary line, and this one's written by Gary Burge. He's a great Johannine scholar. If you ever wanted to read this, is a great book, and it gives just what Karen Jobs here gives, but this is application commentary. It teaches you what it says in the text, but then it teaches you how to live it out in contemporary settings, which is great. The NIV commentaries, are just amazing. I don't necessarily like their NIV Bibles, but I love their commentaries. I actually have a lot here on my bookshelf, but anyway, so to sum it up, I believe that mutually John the Apostle, the quote elder, and the beloved disciple would be the same mutual person who would be the writer of 1 John. Okay? So if you arrive to a different conclusion, then that's fine. We would like to see justification for it, like any position. But that's what we will never know for sure who wrote this, because we can't travel back in time and just ask. And so we don't know for sure, but regardless, this is a canonized book, and this is scripture, and it's authoritative, and we can't diminish its value just because we're not 100% sure who wrote it. Because if you really think about it, we're not 100% sure who wrote anything in the Bible at all. Because even Moses writing the Torah, Moses writing Deuteronomy is highly debatable. and I won't get into the Deuteronomistic history that was posed back in the last century, but it's a stout argument, and we don't know 100% sure who wrote anything. We have general consensus, and we have opinions, and what we want to be true. But remember, we're always here looking for absolute truth. But if we can't arrive at absolute truth, just cannot do it because it's out of our reach and out of our abilities, then we can do the best we can and come up with the best theories and the best positions to hold to. That's what we're doing here. So this teaching series will continue on operating under the understanding that John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, wrote 1 John, as well as the other 4 books typically attributed to him. Okay, so under authorship, are you guys good?
Yeah, makes sense.
Anything I can clear up? I can edit it out of the video.
I pretty much absorbed everything.
Cool.
What about you? Yeah.
All right, cool. If you're good, then we're going to go to date. And like I said, I know we're doing something scholarly here when we're going through the critical introduction, but I do believe that if we're going to completely comprehend any biblical book, it is crucial to understand the background, historical background of the book. Okay, well, because if we understand who wrote the book, like we just have attributed to John the Apostle, then we're going to understand this was an eyewitness account, and some of the things he's going to say is going to have deeper meanings or better meanings rather than if it was just a contemporary guy writing what he saw and what he heard and what he proclaimed and all that. But if we know that it's John the Apostle, or believe it's John the Apostle, it makes it that much more personal because he actually walked with Christ, and it just puts it on a different level. So let's do date now. There are, and date's nowhere near as in depth as authorship, but date, there's typically 2 responses. You've got an early date and you got a late date. Okay, early date is pre-70 AD, year 70. Before that would be early date, sometime before 70 AD. Naturally, it would be, at least after 35 AD, because that's about the time of the crucifixion. That's the general consensus of the time of the crucifixion. So sometime pre-70 AD. Okay, the late date would be post-70 AD, towards the later part of the 1st century, towards like 85 to 90 AD would be the late date. Now, on the early date, the reason people would say that the early date is possible before 70 AD is because a very, very, very significant event in Israel's history happened in the year 70 AD. That was the destruction of the temple. That was when Rome came in and sacked the city. They destroyed the temple, destroyed everything, carried off all the things within the temple, and just obliterated the place. Now, that's a pretty crucial event to happen to a bunch of Jews, which the argument goes for the people of the early date. They say that the letters must have been written before 70 AD, before the destruction of the temple, because they don't mention it. Okay? Does that make sense? They don't mention the destruction of the temple, which was such a significant event that it would have appeared in their writings if it had already happened. Now, a response to this, to say that it wasn't pre-70 AD, would be the idea that maybe John just didn't feel like he should even have to mention the temple. Was the temple significant enough to John at this point, 70 AD or beyond? Was the destruction of the temple significant enough for John to have mentioned? Okay. First of all, 1 John does not deal with anything about worship services or sacrificial offerings or anything like temple oriented. So on one hand, we're like, well, does the destruction of the temple even have a place or a mentioning in this, or would that just be a completely random thought to mention in this letter? Also, at this particular time, the church, the believers in Messiah, had gone out from the temple. They weren't really in the temple anymore. They started moving to the synagogues shortly after the resurrection, and then began to go into home churches. The temple wasn't used that very often. Now, here at RM, we believe that the temple was just as much useful as it is before the crucifixion, because we do see that Paul in Acts 21 continues with animal sacrifices when he goes and buys the animals for the men under the Nazirite vow. It's Acts 21. We know that not one jot nor tittle shall by no means pass from the law till all be done. Not everything's done. So the temple services, the temple, and the things that go on in the temple aren't just neglected. But with that being said, yes, there are home churches, and there were home churches for the first century church, in my opinion, because the temple was ridden with Jewish people of Judaism who were not messianic still. When Paul would go into the synagogues and reason with them day and night, every Sabbath, there were still people who weren't converting. And if you're in there with a bunch of non-converts, and they're threatening to stone you because they think you're following a false god, because they don't believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, then you might want to just go ahead and step on out. Okay, maybe go there for Passover, no doubt, and for Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and all this for every required temple service. But to go and just have your regular Sabbath service in the temple wasn't necessarily something they were doing anymore. They were doing it in home churches because the persecution was already hitting in the later half of the first century. So, what I believe is that it was after 70 AD when this was written. And the reason that the temple was not mentioned is because, one, the letter has nothing to do with the temple, has nothing to do with sacrificial offerings or temple services, and two, that it wasn't of as much significance as it was, okay? And three, if these people are completely aware of the destruction of this temple, then John's not just going to have to come up and say, oh yeah, you remember the temple got destroyed last week or a couple years ago? They're going to know. Remember this quote: the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Okay? What that means is just because something's not mentioned in the New Testament doesn't mean it didn't happen. There are plenty of things that are not mentioned in the New Testament, or plenty of things that aren't taught on in the New Testament that are part of the Torah that we can't just immediately discredit because the absence of the evidence of it doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean that it didn't get taught or something. It just didn't get recorded because there's so many things that are automatically understood. Like the first century, when people are like, oh, the law's done away with, we don't need the Old Testament anymore. Paul never says that, okay? Or anybody of the New Testament. They don't never say, we don't need the Old Testament anymore. And people were like, no, well, just because he didn't say it doesn't mean he didn't mean it. No, what you're missing is that was the only scriptures they had, and Paul had no reason to say, these are your scriptures, because that's what they had. It was understood. So, like I said, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So, what I believe is that the letter was written later, after the gospel, because of its parallels with the gospel, or the similarities between the gospel. Probably somewhere between 90 to 95 AD, whereas the gospel would have been written about 85 to 90 AD. Okay? Are we good on date? We understand the date pretty well now.
Mine
Mine just went blank?
yeah. So we conclude to the date being
90 to 95 AD.
okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So our authorship is John the Apostle, and our date would be 90 to 95 AD. Let's move to purpose and occasion. Now this is where we're going to get very, very vital in understanding, because if we understand the purpose and the occasion for this book, then we're going to understand how we're supposed to interpret it. Okay? The purpose of this book, let's say the occasion first. The occasion is going to be the what question. It's going to be the question of what. Like, what happened to make this book have to be written? Okay? Now, the occasion is, there is a church split. John is writing to his church, or the people in his church who are left after a church split has happened. There have been what they call successionists, which are people who have broken off of the church and have left because of doctrinal differences. They have skewed the theology and the understanding of Messiah and of God, and have severed themselves from the rest of the believers and have left. That's why they're called the successionists. John deals heavily with this throughout the entire letter. Even calls them Antichrist. And a little thing you probably didn't know is 1 John is the only book that deals with the Antichrist, and not the book of Revelation. A lot of people think it is, but you won't find that word in the book of Revelation. It's only in 1 John. And this is who he's attributing to, the people who have left this church. Okay? Because they're against Messiah, anti-Christ. They're teaching against what he really was. And John has written this letter because of these successionists. He's writing it to the people who are left. Okay? They have the center of all of the problem here is Christology. Okay? Study of Christ, or knowledge of Christ. There are many false doctrines have emerged in this book from the people, and John addresses them as thesis statements all throughout the letter, and he deals with them extensively and gives his apostolic authority and shows what the truth of this matter is and why the people who left are wrong. Okay? He calls them liars and tells them that they make God a liar. He addresses such stuff as Docetism, Docetism, which is a form of Gnosticism. It's the belief that appears, like Christ appeared as human, as flesh, but he was fully divine. He was not human at all. He was just fully divine. He appeared as human. John fights this by giving a balance of deism, like an essence of deity, as well as an essence of flesh in this. This is where a lot of like Trinitarianism comes from this book, and the deity of Christ and his position as deity. He addresses stuff like that. He addresses many issues that the people have, such as sin or morality, love, this idea of the in-group versus the out-group, because the in-group would be the people who remained after the split, and the out-group would be those who succeeded off. In a fictive kingship group, a fictive, F-I-C-T-I-V-E, kingship group, is a group of people who have a mutual common bond. Okay? Right now, I and the listeners of this are a fictive group because we're engaging in this discussion together. So we're a fictive group. If when we go to congregation, we're all down there and we're all there to learn about Yahweh and about Messiah, and we're a fictive group at that point because we have a common goal and a common attribute among us. So what he's talking about in here, he's trying to bridge and bring back the broken church and to restore the group, restore the body that was there. He's writing to a really, really broken congregation because there's so many people getting dismayed and upset and just broken because of the successionist and the fact that their church is split, their assembly is split. And the people who split off, John calls them out being pretty evil. So, the people were upset that are left. They're like, how are these people in here? How are they a part of us? So he's writing to a broken church. So that's the occasion. This was what happened that made John write this. Okay? But the purpose, which is the why question, is that he's trying to, like I just said, he's trying to bring this church back to its original state. He's trying to mend it where it gotten broken. He's trying to stitch all the seams back together so that this church can completely get back to operating as the body of Messiah and as an ongoing, growing assembly. He's trying to make sure his church does not diminish and deplete to nothing. The idea here is that John is bringing everyone in this letter that he's written this to back to the basics, the very basics of Christology, of theology, of understanding of everything, because he's an eyewitness. He was there in the beginning. He touched him. He felt him. He's seen him. He heard him. He's bringing everybody back to the very beginning to teach them from square one, which is the great thing about this letter, is because it's going to teach us almost everything we need to know, because of the thesis statements that it makes and the support that it makes and the pastoral nature and the apostolic authority that this book portrays. Shows us the entirety of Christology and what it is about him, what he is, and the nature of him, and to get away from any programming, any false programming that we've had in, possibly from those false teachers that went out that were the successionists, and to bring back to the original understanding and proper understanding of Christ. So, like I said, the recipients of this book would be those who are remaining. Okay, this would be those who are remaining in the church, in the congregation, that did not split off as a successionist. This is an intended audience. Like we said, Revelation 2 actually gives a little bit more if you think about it, because Revelation talks about churches to a specific places. So the greater context would be all of those who are following John. John had been a big pastoral influence in the first century. When he ends up writing Revelation, he sends letters out to all of his pastoral places that he's been and he's known and he's followed. So this is an intended audience, specifically one place. The church father tradition says that this is Asia Minor. Okay, that John fled here after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and fled to Asia Minor, taking along Mary, mother of Jesus, with him to escape death and to escape Roman persecution, and fled to Asia Minor in the area of Ephesus, where Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesians, or the surrounding area, close by Ephesus. Now, the problem is at Ephesus, we get back onto the whole, was it John the Apostle or John the Elder? Because in Ephesus, there are two graves. There are two tombs in Ephesus. One is called John the Apostle, and one is called John the Elder. Now, I'm still convinced that John the Apostle and John the Elder are the same person. So we've got two graves there, and if I'm right and it's one person, it's the same person, then we've got a dead guy buried in a tomb that's not really the dead guy's tomb. That he's been falsely attributed to that tomb. Regardless, this is an Ephesian letter, supposedly by the church fathers, that John wrote this in Ephesus to his congregation in Ephesus. That's the point of trying to figure out where he wrote it, because the congregation would have been there with him in Ephesus. Now, the cool thing about that is this could possibly be the church that Paul started in Ephesus, because Paul started a church in Ephesus, which we can see in the book of Ephesians that he's writing to, and eventually Paul sets up Timothy, his student, whom he calls his son, and that's probably not literal, but figurative, and he sets up Timothy as the head pastor there. And eventually Timothy leaves, and it's believed that John took over after that, because Timothy left after Paul was killed in 68 AD, about the same time that John moved into Ephesus. John moved into Ephesus about the time that Paul died, and shortly after, Timothy left the church and John took over. So that's how we see that this would be where he's at, in Ephesus. Now, the people that would have been in this congregation, okay, this was Caesarea Philippi, was a retired war place. In Ephesus, by geographical location, the people of Ephesus would mostly be Gentiles, non-Jewish people, Gentile believers in Messiah. Now, if there were any Jewish people in this area, they would probably be very Hellenistic. And when I say Hellenistic, I mean really Greek influenced. To Hellenize someone is to bring them into Greek culture and Greek context, and to just Hellenize them. So if we had Jews there, they were probably Hellenistic Jews, which means they were all speaking Greek as their native tongue, because Hebrew and Aramaic were dying out really fast by the end of the first century, if not died out almost completely. So these were going to be Greek-thinking people, which poses a problem because we're worshiping a Hebrew God. But nonetheless, just because you're thinking Greek doesn't mean you can't also think Hebraically. I do both. I have to think Greek when I interpret the New Testament, but I also have to think Hebraically because it's a Hebrew guy writing in Greek. So you got both sides of the stick there. So also the people in the church would probably most likely be families. Now I say this because in the letter of 1 John, John addresses fathers, young men, young children, and fathers again, and stuff like that. So like he's addressing like family-oriented people, like a community of possibly just a bunch of families. Now, this could be real families, or it could go back to that fictive kingship family that we talked about earlier, which is just a family that has a mutual bond, like unity. Doesn't have to be literal descendants of each other, but it could just be about unity. Now, another thing that we're going to want to say, the people here are messianic people. They're not non-messianic people. They are messianic people who believe in Yeshua as Messiah, Jesus as Christ. So we must understand that is who he's writing to. So any theological understanding in this book, the recipient are messianic people. So that's going to shape our interpretation of the book. And that's almost overlooked. We almost just assume they're messianic people. We need to be consciously aware that they are, to understand and have the best understanding of the recipient as we can. So like we said, it's an intended audience after a church split, located in Ephesus, Asia Minor, mostly Gentiles, family-oriented, messianic people. Okay? That's who this is going to be written to. Now, the theme, or the genre, let's do with the genre first. The genre of this, we call it a letter. Okay? The problem is that this letter, what we call a letter, doesn't have like an introduction, like dear so-and-so from John the Apostle. It doesn't have an introduction like a letter, and it doesn't have a conclusion like a letter. Like Paul ends all his letters with a conclusion and talks. And most of the time he says, and I'm writing this in my own handwriting, blah 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 blah. Paul, to say this is who it is. This is an actual true letter that he's writing. The problem with 1 John is we don't have that. The book ends abruptly, as little children stay away from idols. That's the last thing the book says. It's just really sudden and just breaks off real fast and ends. And then it starts with a prologue But the prologue's like the gospel prologue, which is not a letter form. It says, in that which was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. So it starts out with like a pastoral sense, like a sermon. Okay? And that's what most people will attribute this to, is a sermon, not a letter. We call it a letter or an epistle just because that's what we call it. But it seems to be a sermon. Has a bunch of thesis statements, has like a prologue intro, has a bunch of thesis statements, has a bunch of supporting evidence, and just has authority, and then ends with commands. Has a bunch of commands in it. So it's more like a sermon than anything, and this was probably a sermon which John gave and recorded and wrote down, and then ended up passing out to other churches after the successionist left, and then to warn the other churches, and then wrote 2 John and 3 John and sent them out behind it to, to keep it out there that, there's these people out here who are succeeding from our congregation and are teaching all this false doctrine. Don't believe it. Okay, that's probably what he did. That's what I hold to, at least. So this is a sermon, not necessarily a letter. It was a sermon to begin with, and then it might have got sent to somebody, but it was originally a sermon. Okay? Now, the interpretative issues is the last point I want to make. There are some interpretative issues. This is things that make it difficult to interpret this book. We have three excuse me. I have three subcategories of interpretative issues: textual, lexical, and theological. Textual would be literally from the text itself. Things that, like we said earlier, the comma Johannes in 1 John 5:7-8, which only finds itself in the Textus Receptus in just a few manuscripts, ends up in the King James Version Bible. And the Textus, the common Johannes is like a proof text for the Trinity. Whether we're going to be Trinitarian or not on this subject, it's something that doesn't appear in a lot of manuscripts. Now, we can throw it out if we want to. Most people will. Most people say it's not in the majority text. It's in the TR, and that's it. We can't trust it. And other people, on the other hand, are like, well, if it was going to be there, then God put it there, and it should stay there. It's been part of our Bibles for 400 years now, since the King James, or it's been part of the King James Bible for 400 years now. So we might as well keep it. God put it there for a reason. I'm still not convinced that it should be there. Now, there's one thing about textual issues is if a variant comes up in some manuscripts that really contradicts a lot of theology, then it's not got much support, then it's really quickly thrown out. Now, this is when we get to an issue here is, if you're a Trinitarian, this verse does not contradict your doctrine or your theology, which means you wouldn't have to worry about throwing it out. It's just there. It just helps enlighten or illuminate, as my professor would call it, illuminate your doctrine on Trinitarianism. If you're a non-Trinitarianism or non-Trinitarianist, which I know some will be watching this video, then this verse poses a problem because it's straightforward about the Trinity. There are three in heaven, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one, and they testify and agree. To the extent I paraphrase, but that's pretty much what it is. It's straightforward Trinity, and it's all true. It's pretty much what this verse says. It's 1 John 5:7-8. Now, so that poses a problem for the non-Trinitarianists. They're like, no, throw it out. It's contradicting my theology. But can our theology determine whether or not we throw it out? I tend to believe that in textual criticism, if we can determine that it should not be there outside of any theological understanding, if it just shouldn't be there because it's probably not original, then I would throw it out as not inspired. The next part we have is lexical. Okay? Lexical issues. the word cosmos. In English, we would typically say cosmos, which is like the heavens, the sky, outer space kind of thing. John uses this word in ways that's not very familiar to people. He uses it in different ways than we would expect. So it's a lexical problem. It's a word problem. We're going to have a hard time interpreting this because we don't know exactly what John's trying to mean with this word. And there are a number of them. En tautu is another phrase. In this one. That's we don't know exactly what John's meaning by this because it's a foreign phrase that it's not used very often, so it's a lexical problem because we don't exactly know how to interpret this, if he's meaning literally in something or figuratively in something, okay? So stuff like that is some issues. And the last part of the issues, the third part, is theological issues. Okay? We have Christology, like I mentioned earlier, the study of Christ, the knowledge of Christ. Now, John put some stuff in here, some Christological issues, because sometimes he's referring to Christ and God in different times, but then he goes off and just uses a pronoun, a relative pronoun or a personal pronoun, to hint back to one of them, but never really makes it specific which one he's hinting back to. It's very difficult to understand what he's talking about. And you can see how this could pose a problem. Well, is he talking about Jesus or is he talking about God? Okay, stuff like that. I'm under the understanding that he does this on purpose to show in Christology, the understanding of Christ, that there's not much of a distinction between the Father and the Son. You can take that at face value or whatever you want to do, but that's what I operate under. If we can prove that he just does this out of error, then make a case for it, and we'll evaluate it. My position, though, that I'm holding to is the nature of the Greek language and the Greek usage that John uses. He's not making a distinction between the two and showing that they are equality between them. So the interpretative issues, like I said, we've got textual, lexical, and theological. We have to look for those when we're interpreting. And when we get to the text itself in the weeks to come, we're going to take all of this into consideration. But this is a critical introduction that we're going through so that we know all this up front, that this is the stuff we're going to tackle, because this is going to be an extremely deep exegetical exposition of this book. And we're going to see exactly what John's trying to tell the church 2,000 years ago, and then apply that to our lives today and understand what the concepts, the Christology, the theology, the occasion, purpose, why he wrote this, what's going on. If we fall into the category of something that the successionists were believing that John's correcting, then we need to know we need to correct ourselves, okay? Because John's not here to correct us anymore. So we're going to be dealing with all of this stuff in the weeks to come, but don't let it stress you out, because we're going to go through it verse by verse, and we're going to hit this in sections. There's a detailed outline that I'm going to go through. I take it from Gary Burge. I believe he has the best outline of anybody that I've read, whether it be Smalley or Jobs or anybody. I believe that that Burge has the #1 outline for it. And attempts to outline this book are numerous, and it's almost impossible to outline it really because it's so vague in its outline. But I believe that Burge does a really good job. So we're going to hit that. So with that being said, this has been the critical introduction. This is all we've got for the introduction. What next week we're going to hit? We're going to go straight into 1 John chapter 1, verse 1, and go verses 1 through 4, and see what the text itself has to say.